Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're repotting a few orchids, as well as for me to share with you their stories. This video is not so much of a repot tutorial, however, I'm going to share with you some thoughts about why I wanted to repot some of these orchids. Unlike my bloom videos, because a lot of my orchids right now in winter are producing spikes, we don't have flowers to see, so let's take a look at some of the repot materials that I didn't think that they were necessarily long enough for a video. But let's start with number one. This is a species seedling. I have to emphasize this is a seedling because when I first got it, it was so small. This is a Bellina alba seedling. I got it from eBay. I didn't actually confirm with the seller about the size. When I got it, it was so small. I was really shocked, but I stuck with it and I didn't repot it. I just kept growing it until the new leaf grew out and I see that there were more roots growing into the media, and then I decided that okay, maybe I need to repot it. First of all, I didn't like the fact that it was in bark chips because it was such a small cup. It would dry out in 2 days, and for me it was just so difficult to keep this orchid moist. So I decided that I had to do something different because it was just too demanding for me to take care of a seedling like this in bark chips. Thankfully, this orchid had a few decent roots. Some skinny roots based on the size of it. I think those were its seedling roots that had already died away. And it was okay. After I trim all the dead tissue off, it still had about 3 really good roots and then about 4 semi-okay roots. They were pretty skinny. So I decided to use moss because at the time I still had some moss left. So I decided to use moss for this orchid. And the method that I chose for this orchid was the moss no drainage hole method. Thinking that, hey, if I want to keep this orchid more moist, that's really the best way, because for seedlings typically you want to keep it more moist than dry so that seedlings can continue to grow better. And the blue cup here really is to block out additional sunlight so that it would not form algae. If you're okay with the algae, you don't really need to have outer cup. The second seedling is also a Bellina alba. It's a species from a different seller. Now this one, at first I put it in moss and I thought it was doing okay, but then pretty soon I realized it wasn't really growing all that well. I took it out, sure enough. It didn't have good roots to begin with, and then in moss it didn't really grow that much. So I was thinking, gosh, I need to do something different. So I decided to take it out, and this is, already being cleaned, and it was just resting for the 24 hours, and then I repotted. So at the time, end of 2018, so a year ago, 2018, I decided to use semi-hydro, and so I used a combination of hydrocorn and manto clay pebbles, and it was responding. It was growing roots and it was growing a new leaf, so it was doing relatively well for a while. But then I later discovered I made a mistake. I still used a too big of a cup and a little bit too much media, because what happened was the bottom would still be really wet, but then the middle and the top portion would be really, really dry. And so whenever I need to give it water or give it fertilizer, it's just on totally different schedule with compared to all my other orchids. So I decided that I need to do something different so that I can somehow bring back adjust the schedule so that this orchid is also on the same schedule as other orchids for my own sanity. And for this orchid, I also decided to use moss because that was the only type of medium that I had prepared for all the repots that I wanted to do. So it was convenient, it was there, it was already prepared, so moss it was. If you're not familiar with moss no-hoe growing method, I have a few videos talking about that on my channel. You can go to the channel main page and take a look if you're interested. But the key thing here is to not pack the moss too tight, because you really also want to allow the wet dry cycle to complete as soon as possible, preferably within a week, and then you also want to allow aeration, so it has to be really fluffy. Up next is an orchid that has a nickname of Yellow Mini Mark, and this is what it looks like when it's in bloom. Spotty, which I love, and then the orange lip, which I also love. And here is Fel Mini Mark, right? It's white background with spots and orange lip. This is a sequential bloomer that bloomed quite some time with two really long spikes that eventually dried out, so I cut them off. So, I decided to give it a repot because since I purchased it, it was sitting in the same media. So before I took it out, I soaked this orchid really well. I always do that because it's easier to remove moss. And for these tiny little pieces of moss that get in between roots, what you need to do, the easiest way is to take it under a faucet and just use the faucet to rinse away those tiny little residues. So again, moss no drainage hole method for this one. And because it already has really decent root system, so I am not worried about this orchid, other than having to really make sure I don't overwater this orchid. It's in a 16-ounce cup, so every time I water this orchid, I give it 1/8 of a cup, and sometimes if it needs more water, 1/4 cup of water. Up next are two mini Vanda orchids that I have for 3 years now. They were seedlings when I got them. They are still probably not mature, but their roots are not doing so well because I can't keep up with spraying them down with water, and I don't really want to grow them bare roots and having to water every day, so I put some microfiber around their roots, and the microfiber that I used was not very good quality, so it was more plasticky. It's not very water absorbent. So I think that's the mistake I did on that one. So I wanted to try out a different method, but I'm not super confident about using manto clay or hydrocorn pebbles for these two, because Vanda, they really like to grow bare roots. I've seen people with success with bark chips or manto clay material, hydrocorn or leca material, but I really don't know what I'm doing with these two because they have never really done well under my care. So these are really just another try for me to see if they will somehow respond to this setup. We'll see. I don't know. Up next is my Neophanesia falcata or Vanda falcata. This one, I've had this one for about 3 years. When I first got it, it looks like this. So tiny. It's like one fan plus a tiny little growth on the side. After 3 years, it finally has about 4 different fans, but it's never bloomed yet under my care. It's probably still a relatively young plant to begin with. So I wanted to try something different because after I unpotted it, just like you see earlier, it didn't have that many good roots either. So I'm hoping that back to this moss growing media, maybe it will respond better in my new growing environment, my new house, and hope for the better. This Neophanesia or Vanda falcata really is the only falcata that I have in my collection. I haven't had that much experience with them. So this one, it really was my first try, and I think I'm just gonna just keep having one until I know how they act. But I have a lot of friends telling me that it takes forever for them to grow. They're a really slow grower, so patience is highly required. Up next is another Vanda type orchid. This is my Vanda Greenlight. This one, I used to have it in water culture, full water culture, or sometimes semi-water culture. I do let it dry out from time to time, especially when I forget to water it. But it had bloomed before, and here are some of the photos. It's super fragrant. I really enjoy its fragrance. It's like lime citrusy smell with a hint of jasmine. So it was really pleasant smell, which I love, and I really do miss its bloom. So I'm hoping it will bloom really soon. It was doing okay in water culture, but I decided that I want to try something different because sometimes I really simply forget to add water, and I feel like sometimes they're just being dry for too many days until I remember, gosh, they are dry. So I decided to use net pots and separate them, because I have two separate plants in the same vase before. So I decided to grow them separately, use 2 net pots, and then I just basically use moss as the media and just lightly fill into the gaps. So hopefully this is something that they'll enjoy growing into, and I will definitely keep you posted on their progress. But since the bloom, it has focused its energy on putting out a lot of new growths. I think one of them had 2 new growths, and the other one had 1 new growths. So, and they're all growing new leaves, so we'll see what happens next. And finally, I still had some tiny amount of moss left, so I decided to also repot a very sad, sick seedling that somebody else gave me. And because it's so small, so I had to use an 8-ounce cup, and you can see 2/3 of it really is just empty space that I filled up with pebbles, and then only about 1/3 is where the orchid is, and I use just a tiny amount of moss, whatever I had left, to stabilize it. Hopefully that this will provide enough growing condition for it to continue to grow more roots and more leaf. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!